Great thanks to the Australia Institute. What a terrific organisation and vital part of our democracy here in Australia. And we'll be traversing issues fundamental to democracy tonight with Clare. I've got some questions to put to Clare in a moment. But first, I should say that on the way to our function in Melbourne last night, we got news through Clare that the IBAN protesters who were blockading against Tar An, one of the locking giants in Sarawak, had been bashed up, carted off to jail, had their phones and property, including cultural property, burnt by the police, and as far as we know, currently in jail. Tar An is a company that's extended itself to set up in Tasmania, now the biggest logging company in Tasmania. So if any of you are going to Hobart with us tomorrow, we're having a protest outside Tar An at 2:45 tomorrow afternoon to extend our solidarity to the Iban people back in Sarawak. Well, Sarawak has got its share of political crooks and people on the take, but it's also produced a remarkable investigative journalist, and Clare spent the first 8 years of her life in Sarawak, and I might begin by just asking Clare if she'd like to speak to us for a few minutes about her road from being born in Sarawak to being here at Politics in the Pub in Canberra this afternoon.
Well, yes, I think I'm sort of here ostensibly to talk about this massive scandal that I'm sure most of you well-informed people in the room know about, which was the 1MDB kleptocracy scandal in Malaysia, where the Prime Minister of Malaysia now stands very convincingly charged of having misappropriated at least $7 billion worth of development money from his own country into just an orgy of disgraceful, ostentatious, wasteful spending on the part of his family and his cronies. I just put in a warning there. We have a new reforming government in office now, and there is a due process, and Najib has yet to have been found guilty. But he has been found guilty in the court of public opinion, to the extent that in May, a 6-decade-old government, a regime that had not been budged since independence in Malaysia, was against all expectations ejected from power by an outraged populace. And I think it's generally accepted that the 1MDB scandal, the exposure of that, was very instrumental in uniting the country in outrage and really to put aside the very many differences that had been encouraged between different sections of the population to unite against evil, to unite for good against bad. I was the journalist that unveiled that story and spent the last 3 years bit by bit teasing out the detail, and then really sort of in a kind of life and death tussle with this very powerful entrenched regime that pushed back very hard indeed against the factual evidence that I and then increasingly others were bringing out about 1MDB. And I suppose the message from that, and I think the message that Malaysians very strongly feel, is that this is what the free press is there for. And the reason I got involved myself as a relative outsider in this whole issue, well, there are two really. The first was that when I went back to the place of my birth, which was Sarawak in East Malaysia, and saw that there were some things that were really, really wrong, I realized they weren't being reported. And I was a journalist, I was taking family leave at that time, but had spent my, that was those were my skill set. And I started asking the local journalists, this is outrageous. Why have you got one family that has taken ownership of a country that is larger than the United Kingdom for themselves, the richest corner of this earth, exploiting all this wealth, ripping out a rainforest? Why is no one writing about it? And I guess the answer was obvious. There was an incredibly oppressive media environment that had developed in Malaysia, thanks to the sort of virtually totalitarian power that this BN ruling party had. It was that, really, that there was the opportunity presenting itself at that time with the emergence of the internet in that region. And I thought, well, this is an act of conscience. I cannot watch this going on. And so that's why I got stuck in. And by bringing out the stories and bringing out the scandal that was Malaysian corruption, in a way that local journalists had been unable to do, I was able to contribute to affecting change. And we democracies, as much here as there, need to have that free media, that to go around and do its job, which is hold the powerful and the wealthy to account. And Bob and I met over this because another big issue that came out of my experience and my learning curve in trying to draw global attention to the consequences of corruption and ill governance, which is, and I can go into a little bit more detail, what was happening on the ground in Sarawak. I started to realize that this is a global story. And, the same companies, the same entities, and the same wrongdoings that were causing so much distress to the vulnerable indigenous people in Sarawak were also causing problems in Tasmania and indeed throughout the world. And what started as an investigation on the ground into something that was very wrong in a very distant, remote place on the planet turned into a shining light on a mass of issues to do with the way we run our global financial systems and turn a blind eye to this kind of corruption, as major banks, major institutions, professional classes in all fields across the West assist in funneling out these vast sums of money that are being stolen from people by local corrupt politicians through the offshore system, which has very conveniently been evolved to assist in this practice and into investment in our more developed economies. And one of those investments, of course, was a bunch of sawmills in Tasmania that started ripping out Bob's forest. And that's when we got to meet, first time 7 years ago. But
how dare they? And Claire's not a newcomer to being threatened. And we'll have a little bit more of that later on. But one of the very earliest threats was one unusual one, Claire, when you went back to Sarawak and found yourself in the middle of the night in a canoe with a 9-centimetre draft, paddling against large floats of native lilies in amongst huge crocodiles. What was going on there?
Bob's been reading the book. Yes, some people sometimes ask me what was your most frightening moment, and they expect me to sort of say maybe being stalked by hard men hired by Najib, but yeah, nothing much beats going up a vast inky black river known to be crocodile infested in a very wobbly boat at 9 o'clock at night. With a bunch of very, very agile and able native people, and then, very wobbly me in this boat that we were going up to see the scene of one village that was trying to protest against the ruination of its remaining forest area. And they were very, very eager to get me up there. The bottom had fallen out of the Jeep. We were late, and the guys who'd taken me up there put their heels down. They said, no, sorry, we're not from in this area, but we do know this is a crocodile infested river and there's no way we're going anywhere near it. So the Iban local people said to me, Claire, don't worry about this, we're fine, we can navigate this. We have a torch so we can see, and it's only an hour, it's pouring with rain, and we've got this little putt-putt thing and we're going upstream. And I sort of get in and I think, well, there's this very, very sophisticated couple who had got me involved in all of this. They were very, very successful couple who'd left the village and done well in the oil industry. And I thought, well, if Helen and Numkan can go up in this boat, then so can I. So I get in there and we're chugging up, and they're very, very, it seemed the pollution of the river, thanks to the oil palm plantations, had caused these lilies, which were beautiful, but terrifyingly beautiful because there were clumps of them. They said, well, of course it's become very dangerous now in the river because the fertilizer leaches in and they've got out of control and they're tipping over our boats. And so I'm thinking, oh, you know, and so we go up this river, and I say to Helen, are you sure we shouldn't be worrying about these crocs, you know? And she said, no. She said, I am completely happy about the crocodiles. We Ibans, we say they are our ancestors. They never attack us, only foreigners. Oh, that was frightening.
Well, Claire survived, but you went home, I'm shorthanding here, you went home to London. Why didn't you get about your business? Why did you determine that you were going to do something about what was happening back in Malaysia?
I'm sure all of us have sort of come to points in your life where you think, I'm just not, you know, I can see no one else is doing anything about this, and if I don't, actually no one is going to do it. And it was one of those moments. I had a passion for Sarawak. I'd grown up there as a little girl, and I knew what a wonderful, special place it was on the planet. And you know, my parting memory of it, being sent home to boarding school at the age of 8, was spending that hour in that low propeller plane looking out over that wonderful canopy, which was an image that rested with me for the next 10 years as I trudged my way through various boarding schools in the colder parts of southern England. And when I came back all those years later to see that the whole thing had been reduced to a monoculture palm oil plantation, and I started to learn about the impact on the indigenous people as a result of this, because they had received none of the benefits of this so-called progress and modernization, and the impact, the environmental consequences were beyond description. I realized that I couldn't get any real international interest. It had been overlooked by Western media, and I sort of looked at it this way and that way, and I thought, well, something has to be better than nothing. And so I started this internet site, which started to really get some good impact, because what I was by background was an investigative journalist, and I could see that this was a drop-jaw story of massive corruption. And I knew from my experience that people love hearing about the exposure of the rich and powerful in their countries. And I thought, well, the corruption is blatant. It's lying on the ground. I can go into company's house and find 60 companies that belong to the family of this Taib Mahmood, who was the chief minister and finance minister and plantation minister and just about every other minister. And I can prove that he handed all these concessions and contracts to himself. Let's get going. And not only could I do that, I could bring something that people really didn't know about. I could use my footprint abroad to start looking at where the money was going. And I spent a few months before I really launched my project, seeking out his foreign properties, seeking out where that hidden siphoned money was, after it had been circulated and packed away, where it was popping up again in Canada, vast possessions in America, UK, and of course Australia. It was very revealing, and I managed to dig up some whistleblowers, so I got some really, really good information on Taib. And then I started unleashing the stories, and it worked. I caught attention immediately, locally. Nobody else was listening, but this was a Malaysian story. Only Malaysians could change it, so this was about bringing awareness to Malaysians. So I started unleashing these stories.
Taib, T-A-I-B, the Premier of Sarawak, equivalent to the Premier of New South Wales, had been at uni in Adelaide, and later, and as far as I know, still owns the Hilton Hotel, amongst other things, in Adelaide. Gone back, but without money, and has become one of the richest people on the planet. Claire, you decided that one thing that was missing was coverage of this corrupt regime back in Sarawak, and you set up Radio Free Sarawak. Tell us about that.
Yes, it was a natural progression. what we were achieving was a real impact on public opinion in the urban areas on the coast. So all those people the new generation of internet users were cottoning onto my stories, and their suspicions were being borne out. They were, I was being I was really giving them quite hard evidence of what was going on, and they could see that Tide wasn't really able to argue back on this. But of course, the Malaysian regime federally kept in power by and large for what they called the safe deposits of the rural seats of Sarawak. And Sarawak was, kept control of that state, the Tide did, through these rotten boroughs, tiny little communities that he had totally under his control. And, he would give them a bit of, seed corn at election time, and they would vote obediently, as they were told they must, if they wanted not to go against the government and be, caught for being, agitators against the state. That's how he controlled the place. And I thought, well, they need a different narrative, don't they? I can't reach them by the internet because these are communities without electricity, without water in very many cases. How do I reach them? And there was an old-fashioned solution, which was the largely redundant shortwave radio, which you can beam out of London via a bunch of largely unused anymore, but very keen to get any business they can, relay stations across Central Europe and Asia and right into the jungle in Sarawak. And I discovered I could do that quite cheaply and got a philanthropist to agree to pay for it. And that's why I was actually there with the crocodiles. I'd had to sneak over the border. I'd been banned by this stage from Sarawak, obviously, arbitrarily. So in order to get my DJ, I needed to persuade him. So I snuck over the border via this little adventure, got down to Kuching, lassoed Peter John, who was a fantastic activist, opposition supporter, and was renowned as a DJ and had been kicked out of his job for being too, rebellious. And we sat down, and it was a very hard persuasion job. I said, Peter, I'm asking you to leave your family and go up against the regime and come and join me in London for no money. And we're going to run this radio station between now and the next election. It could be 6 months. And it, I have to say it's going to be really, there's going to be no reward. And, you could be identified. He said, yeah, okay, I'll come. So, and if it wasn't for the fact that Malaysia was full of brilliant people like that, May the 9th would not have happened. But Peter was one of them. He said, I'll call myself Papa Orangutan and see if I get away with it. So Papa Orangutan and I started up Radio Free Sarawak, and we made a bit of a hit.
Yeah. And we'll jump from there, because it wasn't the government of Sarawak, but the federal government, equivalent of Canberra, in Kuala Lumpur, that came under your investigative eye. And tell what is 1MDB?
It's a development fund, allegedly. that was the sort of, palatable, presentation. It was actually a deliberate grand theft of public money from beginning to end, I would assert, and I think that most people in Malaysia would agree with me now. What happened was that I spent several years, actually, about at least 3 years, working with these projects and working, 24/7 really, on unveiling this disgusting corruption that was driving deforestation, mindless, unnecessary deforestation that was of no benefit to anyone in East Malaysia apart from a handful of families, and was actually leaving native people starving because their jungle was being, and their source of food and livelihood and the rivers were being destroyed, just taken from under them. So after 3 years, the whole of Malaysia was following all this stuff, and there'd been anti-corruption commission investigations into Taib and also into his neighbouring equivalent in Sabah, which is also somewhere I spent childhood time. It's another beautiful rainforest state with another equally disgusting and evil chief minister, although I have to say he's been washed out and has been replaced by a much better character who wants to reform the state. But at that time, I had got some great dirt on him, basically his bank account details from a very handy whistleblower.
Where'd you get that from?
From a very handy whistleblower. And those bank account details had shown how he had managed to layer and, hide and circulate hundreds of millions of dollars worth of timber kickbacks. It was lovely. The bank statements, and the receipts from the timber barons who were paying him would say logging concession. How you say sort of, purchase or book or something. They had logging concession as the explanation for the $2 million here and there. And I had it all there. It went through HSBC, and there's a big, actually, thank God, the Swiss prosecution is now underway against, first HSBC and then UBS took on the lucrative work. And they are now facing...
UBS being one of the biggest banks in Switzerland, isn't it?
Yes, I think, if not the biggest.
If not the biggest, yeah.
So all these were... And of course, what was massively frustrating was that the central government was doing absolutely nothing about it. I mean, it's the federal government that's responsible for law and order and the police and anti-corruption and for investigating rogue politicians. And clearly that wasn't happening. And so therefore, inevitably, we know that corruption begins at the top, and I started looking at, why we weren't getting any progress and started focusing on the highly corrupt Prime Minister, Najib Razak. And up until that time, I hadn't wanted to get involved in the political situation in Malaysia, but I found myself wondering about Razak, and he had an immense amount of money that he was ostentatiously spending. Malaysia by that time, 2013, was already awash with rumour, concern and open criticism by the opposition of this fund that was very specific to Najib. He'd set it up almost immediately on taking office, and the theory behind this supposed development fund was that he'd borrow masses of public money and then prove he was a bit of an entrepreneur. So he would then invest it for people and get, wow profits, and then that would go into making people's lives better. This was the sort of narrative. Well, the first thing he did was borrow this money at about twice the market rate that he needed to, which everyone thought was a bit suspicious. And then the second thing that happened is, fast forward 4 years to 2013, no one knew where the money had gone. And when they started up saying, where's the money gone? They weren't getting, satisfactory answers, and the audits had been constantly delayed. So there were no annual reports, and they'd got through 3 auditors, and, opposition politicians were beginning to say, what's going on? By the time I got to covering it, they were $12 billion had been borrowed and were unaccounted for. So this was the situation, and
you went to Hollywood.
Well, this got me to Hollywood. This got me into a global story of just, immense excess, the sort of story that I am just not used to dealing with. Tinseltown, Las Vegas, super jets, super yachts, master fraud, bespoke commissioned fleets of fancy sports vehicles, the Beverly Hills mansions. This was the stuff of 1MDB, because what had also come into my understanding, and indeed everyone in Malaysia knew, that the man most associated, apart from Najib, with 1MDB was this billionaire, this youthful billionaire in his 20s called Joe Low, who was a Chinese Malaysian, who was an advisor to Najib. That's he'd come from nowhere, was an advisor to Najib, and was suddenly this massive billionaire who was notorious. He'd been getting news coverage all over the hotspots in the world for spending ridiculous sums of money. He'd go in, he'd notch up, champagne record spending in any nightclub you care to mention. He was having massively ostentatious parties in Las Vegas. He was running around with Leo DiCaprio and all the actors, and and he was just, it was ridiculous. So everyone was wondering, and he was known as the Malaysian man of mystery. And so where all this came together for me as someone looking at this as a journalist, doing my job as a journalist, I would say, was that when one Christmas I saw the billboards and realized that there was this movie coming out that was the big movie at the time, Wolf of Wall Street, which was all about the ostentatious spending of stolen money. Someone got in touch with me and said that this had been produced by Najib Razak's stepson. So I thought, well, that's interesting. And his mother, the wife of Najib, was also equally famous in Malaysia. If there are any Malaysians in the room, we all know about Rosma. She makes Imelda Marcos look like a cheapskate. Imelda was into shoes. Rosma, when they finally, raided the house after the election, they found 274 boxed Birkin handbags. And, for the uninitiated, those each cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this woman, and she was a diamond holic. She bought hundreds of millions of dollars worth of diamonds. So this ghastly woman, her son was going around bragging about how he was producing this film. And as I started to dig into it, it became very clear that he was being regarded as the financier of the movie, which was impossible. It was impossible to be legitimately the financier of the movie. He was also just into his 30s. He had a very undistinguished couple of years experience at work as a junior bank clerk, and was then turned up in Hollywood and called himself a successful financier. He was supposed to be behind this $100 million movie, plus certain unspecified mysterious Asian investors. So I was looking at this and, wondering and digging further. I had one of those moments where you see something in plain sight, because all the pictures of the launches, with all the stars and Leo DiCaprio, Margot Robbie, they're all lining up promoting Wolf of Wall Street next to Reza and Martin Scorsese, the director, and Joe Low is in every single shot. And I went, okay, that's interesting. And then I watched further and found that Leo DiCaprio had won the Golden Globe Award for that movie and had gone up on stage and thanked Reza and Joe for taking a risk on the movie. And at the end of that movie was an almost unprecedented accolade to Joe Low, which was a full screen thank you credit, no details. And I thought this was worth asking a few pertinent questions. My job. So I wrote an article called Malaysian Money, Wall Street Greed, in which I asked if the disappearing billions from the 1MDB fund, for which Joe Low was the advisor to Reza's dad, had anything to do with the hundreds of millions that were turning up, funding Reza's film. And that was the beginning of my adventure, because I immediately had a barrage of legal letters, lots of threats, and also some brilliant tip-offs, which took me to Hollywood, where I was able to, I masqueraded on the advice of somebody very helpful. I masqueraded as a building supply delivery lady. I remember saying to this guy, I do sound very British, and I'm going to be very embarrassed ringing up and pretending in Hollywood to be a delivery lady. And they talked of Hollywood stuffing with Brits posing as, acting as delivery women. Get on with it. So I did. I got away with it, and they gave me the address for Reza's Beverly Hills mansion, which, of course, as a young man with no visible means,
This is the Prime Minister's stepson.
This is the Prime Minister's stepson. I mean, it's one thing to kind of hint that somebody might have given you the money to invest in your first movie, even though you don't have a clue about making movies. They might have given you 100,000 just because you're bright and brilliant. You might be able to get away with that, but that same person is unlikely to be kind enough to buy you a $35 million mansion in the best part of Beverly Hills, which you then decide to raze to the ground, which is how I found it, and rebuild in a different style just because you've got the money. So I was on the hunt by that stage, and that was the beginning of my unraveling of this outrageous story.
And it gets more outrageous, and jumping ahead, tell us about Kevin.
Oh, huh. Well, there was a lot of pushback on this story. And I'd broken that story thanks to this data from Petrosaudi that a whistleblower had given me. One of the directors of Petrosaudi had realised what they were up to, fallen out with them, left, and gave me this amazing cache of information. And they had conspired to get him into a Thai jail in revenge. And he spent the next 18 months in a Thai jail, thanks to false representations from those Petrosaudi guys, aided by the Malaysian government, and he was forced to make a false confession, which actually included alleging that I had somehow nefariously forged some 300,000 emails that had been so incriminating on this. But so this had become a sort of real tussle, and by the time we got to Kevin, Najib had originally reckoned he could probably handle this, and had initiated some inquiries, local inquiries, when I first started breaking the story and showing how the money had come out and gone into Jolo's companies. And he pretended to be shocked and, concerned, and, that the guilty would be found punished if there were any guilty people. And of course, the Malaysian investigators turned out to be really very effective. Within a month, they'd actually unravelled a great deal of where this money had gone. And they also turned out to be handily very communicative with myself. And I managed to get the most fantastic leak, which showed that out of several payments that Najib got, there was one particular payment of $681 million that they identified coming into his personal named bank account at AM Bank in KL, just before the election, which he had poured money in to win. And I will, just as an aside, and I am coming to Kevin, but I would like you Australians to know, if you don't, that the major shareholder of AM Bank in KL was ANZ Bank Australia. And ANZ Bank Australia made a very big thing about the reliability of this local Malaysian bank, because all the top brass in KL had been seconded from ANZ Bank headquarters in Australia. So their chief executive, their finance officers and their risk officers and compliance officers, all these senior people were Australian citizens seconded from this major bank. It's something I've said very often on my blog, and I've really taken every opportunity to go on about. As you can see, so far nothing has been done by your government or your regulatory authorities to look into why they failed to notice that this money was illegally coming into the Prime Minister. This enormous billions of dollars worth of stolen money was coming into the Prime Minister of Malaysia's account. But to move on, having exposed that, Najib realised he was in a tight place and issued a major crackdown. And that involved sacking his deputy, who'd started asking questions by then. Of course, in any normal country, Najib would have been expected to step down by that stage, and the deputy would have taken power. And clearly, that's what the deputy thought should have happened. And he sacked a number of other very senior people, including his Attorney General, who was retired on ill health, but in fact marched from his desk at gunpoint. And there was a coup, effectively, an internal coup by Najib against his own government. And the world sort of reported that Najib had got everything back under control again, and Malaysia was solidly back under his control. That was the reporting, infuriatingly at the time. 3 days after that, I got a very interesting document that came my way, which consisted of a draft charge sheet that appeared to have all the signs of being genuine, and I tested it out as best I could. It appeared to be from the Attorney General's office, and it cited the state of Malaysia versus Najib Razak and the details of money that the Attorney General was planning on charging him with having stolen from 1MDB. And so it was one of those calls, but I thought, well, this is a moment of national crisis, and I published that document. And although, of course, it was immediately said that I was passing fake news, and this was a fraudulent, forged document. Within 24 hours, it was also announced that there was going to be a major inquiry into the leak of the forged document. So that kind of rested my concerns about the authenticity of it, and I was kind of moving on. But a few days later, I noticed that the Malaysian media had picked up on a mysterious disappearance of one of the prosecutors that was believed to be most intimately involved with the Attorney General, the sacked Attorney General, in the 1MDB case, and that was Kevin Moraes. And his body was later found, 10 days later, encased in a cement barrel full of concrete. It was a very, very shocking moment. And one of his colleagues contacted me at that time and said, we in the civil service of Malaysia have been given a warning. That was how it was interpreted. Now let me again put in a caveat there. Najib and his administration said there was another reason. In fact, 2 days after, or indeed I think less than 2 days after his body was found, the head of police said it was an open and shut case and they already knew who was responsible, and it was to do with something else entirely, and a bunch of gangsters have been picked up, and there's currently a case going on in KL where those gangsters are saying that they were beaten up and told they had to confess to this. So that was what happened to Kevin, and that was the sort of pushback that we were discovering. It had actually emerged, there was CCTV of what happened to him. He'd been traveling in rush hour through KL traffic in a moving car, and just in front of the camera you can see he was brought to a halt by someone ramming him from behind, and you can see the cars coming the other way. It was 2-lane traffic. Kevin gets out to say what the hell to the guys behind him, and 6 guys jump out of the back car. They grab Kevin, pull him into the car behind. Somebody jumps into Kevin's car, and the 2 cars drive off. So, you know, this was a chilling story of, you know, mass theft, murder involved, pushback, enormous campaigns to vilify me through this period and discredit me in order to kill off this story. But again, all these sort of great themes, politics, business, global corruption, it all came, for me, it came back down to look at what turning a blind eye to this high-level corruption does. It results in rainforests being destroyed in a handful of years and billions of people suffering unnecessarily deprived lives. So it's been a learning curve for me, and it was a message that I really want to get out to people like you.
I think the important thing there, Claire, is that on 9th of May this year, the people of Sarawak, and indeed the people of the whole of Malaysia, voted for the first time in 65 years to change the government, horrified by what had happened. And there's always, these things are always multifactorial, but Clare Rewcastle's determination, her courage, her intellect, her ability, her willingness to take risks against a whole array of power figures and moneyed figures changed not only the fate of Malaysia into the future, but of course it sent a message right around the world that it comes from watchfulness of all of us. Good government will come from watchfulness of allness, from all of us, and they just should not be allowed to get away with it. Claire, before we get on to questions, thank you for that story. You're a great Earth citizen, not just an environmentalist, but a great human being who's made a change because of your determination that evil wouldn't overcome good. Thank you, Clare Rewcastle Brown.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. We've got time for a couple of questions, so of either Bob or Claire. So if you've got something more you'd like to ask, Hannah's got a mic and she can get to you.
Question to possibly both of you. How much chance is there that a federal anti-corruption body in Australia will uncover the dirty money that's driving commercial interests against national interests?
Well, I have to say, I am astonished because Malaysia has a federal anti-corruption commission. And although it has been hamstrung in many ways by government interference, it has also done some very good work. And Malaysians know it's there, and they put pressure on it to do its job. And I am astonished to have been told by Bob that you don't have one here in Australia. So.
It is remote, and of course, when I was working for Ben up at Parliament House over those years, a number of times moved for an anti-corruption commission that must have teeth, like the one in New South Wales. It was voted down by both the big parties. I'm very pleased that the Labor Party has now joined the Greens in pushing for an anti-corruption commission, but it will be useless unless it has teeth. So Clare's story, of course, points to the urgent need for such an independent watchdog over the affairs of politics and business in this country.
Maybe there are no corrupt issues in Australia.
We could start with that governance issue involving ANZ, but much more indeed.
If you want to find out a little bit more about the moves towards the federal ICAC, hit on the Australian Institute website. You see we've established a National Integrity Committee with former judges and corruption fighters to do just what Bob says, try and get a federal ICAC with teeth. I've just got off the phone to a key figure in the opposition to talk about the hung parliament and to ensure that if such a body does come to pass, it has teeth. And it's putting together a renewed briefing paper that looks at the failure of state anti-corruption agencies like the one in Tasmania. Not realised, but the worst of that corruption is still to go to trial in New South Wales, and of course involves the secret and potentially illegal, but as ICAC found, corrupt granting of coal licences in New South Wales. So the exploitation of a country's resources has too often resulted in corruption, and it's not theoretical, as we've seen, and it's not theoretical in this country. And it's only through a strong anti-corruption watchdog with teeth, like the one in New South Wales, that has uncovered that. And Australia's just got a big program working towards a federal one, and there's still a long way to go. So if you want to support that program, please join us to do so. We've got time for a couple more. We've got one at the front here, Hannah.
So the recent Royal Commission into the banking sector in Australia found that essentially all of those institutions and the activities that they were undertaking was driven by greed. And we're all taught as people that greed doesn't tend to serve us very well in the long term, that generally you will often get caught out for being greedy. And the activities in Malaysia, it sounds like a lot of what was driving the discontent of the people was the ostentatious demonstration of greed that those parliamentarians, the politicians and their families had, and that they were so blatantly spending this wealth that was unjustified in their position. Do you think that without that level of ostentatious demonstration of greed, that you're able to properly detect some of these actions? And maybe that's one of the issues we have in Australia, is that our politicians and our people in power don't tend to behave that way.
Well, I think something we haven't got round to talking about that's absolutely fundamental in this story was the absolute key factor that got Najib. And that was official action. Now, I could never have survived this if riding to my rescue, like the World War II Australians and Americans who came and helped Britain, I felt that way, was the FBI. Now, the Americans had come to the conclusion that the correct conclusion that corruption affects us all negatively and not just the first case victims, that actually the influx of corrupt money into America, I suspect they worked it out a little too late, but was dangerous and destabilizing for their own democracy. And in 2014, they set up a joint initiative between the DOJ and FBI called the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Unit. And these were the guys that I rang up when I first started to get all this information from the Middle East. I haven't told you about the Abu Dhabi angle, and you know I mean, I can't tell you about the ostentatious spending going on there. But I gave all this to the FBI, and they went away for a year. And then after Najib had done all this that I've described, and he reckoned he'd got the lid on everything, and the world press opined, you know, that the case was closed and Najib had been found innocent by his own newly appointed Attorney General, the FBI came and dropped a bloody bombshell, and they had investigated the whole thing using the clearing system that enabled them to be able to trace every single damn dollar, and they'd done it. And it was like this moment of vindication. And the whole of Malaysia went, oh my God, you know, who were they going to believe? And of course they believed the independent authority. You know, there was a lot of pushback against the FBI for this. Malaysia was a valuable ally politically for America geopolitically, and you know, it was not a done deal that America wanted to be annoying Malaysia into the arms of China, which is to an extent what nearly happened. So it was that decision, that willful decision to do their job on the part of the Americans. I mean, the Brits did nothing. They turned the usual blind eye, although a lot of this money was going through Britain, just as it was through Australia. And the Brits have been worse than the Australians in not doing anything about this. But the Americans, the Singaporeans in the end, and the Swiss and other countries who were caught up in this global outrage, they did do something, and that's what made the difference. So yes, we need to force our authorities to do their jobs on this matter.
And Bob Brown and Australian Institute. My question is to Clare. Clare, where are you at with the past receiving 90 million case? Where are you at with that, one? And two, were you in any stage when you were doing the investigation afraid that you could have been another Kevin Mariah? Because we, as the reader of Sarawak Report, did worry for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I was living, unlike Kevin, I was living in London. So I wasn't in the jurisdiction and under the control and the power of a negative, totalitarian by that stage, and very malign, defensive, cornered regime. So I felt much safer than many of those very brave Malaysians who stuck their necks out and stood up for right in their own country. But yes, I did feel nervous for quite a lot of the time. You know, I used to take the stupid precautions like not standing too near to the curb when I was crossing the road, and back against the wall in the tube station, and silly things like that. And I did have a period where I was definitely being followed and harassed and had to go and ask for police support. But in terms of, I think you were asking something else related to that. Oh gosh, yes. This is a lawsuit, so it's limited in what I can say. But one other way that the super wealthy and super powerful can get at critics, particularly journalists, is via our wonderful libel system. And you can cost a journalist an awful lot of money just by setting rolling an action. This case, if it comes to court, will cost millions, because libel lawyers deserve to be paid, to write a letter what you or I would expect to be paid for a months of hard work. And it's a wonderful industry, and you will find it used against you, and that's not the only case I've got. But I've stuck to my grounds on that case. I can't comment on it in detail, and I'm feeling fairly confident that I'm in a good place with that case. That's all I can say.
One straight behind you.
I'm nominally Malaysian and have grown up hearing about Malaysian politics, but not really deeply engaging with it. And when Mahathir was elected earlier this year, when I looked at the people that I knew in Malaysia, it was kind of heralded as the sort of this new, as the dawn of the new era. But at the same time, I was thinking that it's not really a shape of the old guard. What do you think this means for Malaysian politics, and do you think that it really is a change?
Things could have gone very, very badly for Malaysia if Najib had managed to cling on to power, because he's a wounded tiger. He is a guy that had, that was internationally exposed as a criminal and was needing to come down, with a hard fist on critics in order to protect his position. You'll know that he'd enacted, Malaysia was already oppressive. He came in with the world's first fake news law, a whole panoply of oppressive legislation that gave him totalitarian power. He could call an emergency situation, he could bring out people, troops onto the street, and he had specifically legislated that if anyone was killed in the way, there would be no inquest. We've seen those sorts of regimes in Southeast Asia, and Malaysia was looking at becoming one of them. That was the threat. And instead, what they achieved in Malaysia by coming together as a nation and voting that out, voting successfully for peaceful democratic change for the first time in the nation's history, was a massive, beneficial alternative. And just by having achieved that, they're on a good path rather than on a really dreadful, frightening path. And I think everyone in Malaysia feels that. That's what's happened in Malaysia, and the optimism is palpable.
Can you please thank Clare Rewcastle and Bob Brown?